Hi, everyone. George Christie here with Wine Industry Network. I'd like to welcome you to the Wine Industry Sales Symposium replay. We recently had our Sales Symposium conference in person, and it was a terrific day. It was well attended. We covered some great topics. We had some awesome speakers, but there were a few sessions that we wanted to call out and share with a broader audience for those of you that either couldn't attend in person or even for those that did attend in person, but perhaps were in another session. So today we're going to be talking about data-driven insights, sales trends and predictions, really looking at how the wine category is performing and what those indicators are telling us we might expect going forward. We're going to talk about adapting your PR strategy for an evolving media landscape, where we've got some public relations professionals with a lot of experience talking about how their job has changed and the way that they manage the media has evolved. I think you're going to really enjoy that. And finally, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence and how that's impacting the way that we market and sell our wines. So we're going to begin with looking at the data-driven insights. But before that, I want to thank all of our sponsors for their support. In particular, I want to thank RedChirp, who is our replay sponsor. We wouldn't be able to do this without them. So this first session is presented by Danny Brager and Dale Stratton. And once again, thank you for being with us today. I hope you enjoy the session.
You've got a lot to communicate, and if you can just get people to pay attention, you'll delight your customers and sell more wine. But people ignore emails and screen calls. Everyone does read their text messages, but alcohol regulations make compliance a bear. Use RedChirp to cut through the noise. Convert website traffic into reservations and sales with web-to-text chat. Reliably reach members about customizing club orders, declined cards, and delinquent pickups. Exceed your sales goals with customized promotions that make everyone feel like a VIP. Securely collect credit card info 6 times faster. Reduce returns and no-shows with completely automated shipment notifications and reservation reminders, while order attribution automatically connects text to sales so you know what's working. RedChirp is trusted by wineries of all sizes and integrates with your other tools. Get more leads, make more sales, and build stronger relationships with RedChirp.
George, thanks for having us. Having seen those polls, we should have just done 40 minutes of polls, actually. That looks really cool. I like how that moves around.
Still can.
We still can. Thanks for having us. Good morning, everyone. Dale Stratton and myself are going to provide a bit of an overview of the current state of the wine industry. Hopefully that'll lay a bit of a foundation for some of the other really interesting topics and how we address some of the challenges today. Dale and I both work with, let's get the slide up there. Dale and I both work with Azure Associates. Azure is a firm that provides comprehensive advisory services to the wines and spirits industry. We come from sort of different parts of the business in our experience. I worked on the data supplier side, where I headed up the Nielsen Beverage alcohol practice for upwards of 20 years across beer, wines, and spirits. Dale worked on the winery side, heading up category management, and then insights at companies like Gallo and Constellation. And now we're both consultants, and we work with many different data sets, including some of these and many more. So we're going to start off, and I'm going to ask Dale to give us a little bit of his sage advice.
Yeah, so the advice that we would give, go ahead, hit it, that the kind of where we are in our journey in the wine industry. And hit it again, Danny. Right now, the last 3 years really do qualify as this, right? That we've really been through a lot of disruption. There's just some things, unprecedented things that have happened. It's impacted everything. It's impacted the numbers that we're going to use, and Danny and I are going to show you, of course, a lot of numbers, and we're going to talk about a lot of things. You have to know the context of a lot of these numbers to really get the story as to what's happening. So our category is under pressure. We're feeling a lot of pressure points, a lot of headwinds, if you will. And I think that the first thing that we have to think about, always starting with the consumer, and that the consumer is evolving, and the consumer is really, with the ethnicity changes that are happening, don't fit. We'll show you how this works in with our category. Economic conditions are tough right now, right? Every trip to the grocery store now reminds you of how this has changed really over the last 2 years. Market growth has compressed. We'll spend a fair bit of time talking about that, what that looks like, and really what that means. The consumer is continuing to premiumize. They're drinking better. They're just not drinking more. And I think that we'll point out some reasons as to why that is and what we can do as a category to start to come back against that and start to win again. And then there's always route to market challenges. And we'll talk a little bit about some route to market challenges in really a compressing marketplace that's out there. So with that said, Danny, why don't you tell us a little bit about where that leaves us as an industry?
So there's no shortage of data out there, but I think if you put it all together, and we, like I said at the beginning, we like to look at a lot of different data sets from a lot of different angles to try to get the best sort of collective perspective. And I think there's no question that we've sort of come from the situation in past years, going back 3 or 4 years ago, where we had long years of history of the rising tide lifting all boats, to one where it's flat at best, and frankly, I think that shrinking is the more likely current situation that we're in. Which means that for the most part, we've got to figure out how to win in a flat market, which means sort of we take share, but that's going to come from somebody else. And some of that's likely self-inflicted, things we have done or not done to ourselves. Some of it certainly relates to competitive factors, because we don't live in a vacuum. Most wine drinkers don't just drink wine, they drink other things or don't drink at all in some cases. And then there's societal factors like social moderation, et cetera, that are also playing into all of this. There's certainly, I know you're feeling cost pressures, and the one thing that I'm pretty confident that we can't do is just take price and hope that that relieves all the issues that we have. So we've got to figure out how to win in that flat market. And I think, sorry, let me go back one. I don't know where the inflation slide went. Let me see if it's coming up. Oh, here we go. Let me just show you this inflation slide, and then I'll go up. These actually are government numbers, the ones that are released every month by the Census Bureau. I updated numbers for April of 2023, which just came out yesterday, actually. So you can see overall CPI, where things were in December and where things are now. And a couple things that strike out to me is, one is that wine inflation, people taking prices, is pretty low, certainly comparative to the cost pressures that I'm sure we're all living with. Unlike, for instance, you go to the beer side, they've taken up price religiously, even more so in the past year than they have in the past. And you can see some other categories. So while overall inflation is coming down, still somewhat high, which means the Fed's going to keep some pressure on. And the other thing that I've noticed is, for wine, the at-home inflation is relatively low. Producers have not really wanted or been able to take price like they might have wanted to. The other thing is the wine in the on-premises, the inflation rates are pretty high, up 7%. So that's not the producer passing on prices, that's the operator taking price to offset some of their issues, costs, et cetera, but also might be a hindrance to on-premise consumption. So now let me go back. So the question is, how do we win in a flat market? And I guess the first question that I would ask is, what market do you play in? There's lots of different aspects of this business. Are you DTC? Are you 3-tier? Are you both? If you're 3-tier, you're going after chain business, independent business. Are you regional, national? And then there's a whole bunch of choices that you have or presumably have in terms of the portfolio that you go to market with. So the first question is, which business are you in? Which business, is a good business to be in? We're going to try to address some of those things in terms of within that flat market, what businesses are growing, et cetera. So the question that I would have for you is, what's your focus and what's your priority, your set of priorities? And frankly, if everything is a priority, then really nothing is a priority. So do what you do and do that best. So let me just talk about the consumer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dale to give us a little bit more color on the consumer. But Dale alluded to some of these as sort of consumer drivers just generally in the market today. People that are consuming across beverage alcohol, not just wine. People drinking better, not necessarily more. There's certainly an increasing consumer attention to how their consumption habits, drinking behaviors coexist within a healthier lifestyle, as well as to products that sustain a healthier environment. Consumers are seeking experience, they're seeking authentic brands, authentic stories. They're more than ever seeking convenience, not only in what they buy and the occasion that they're buying for and drinking at, but also in terms of how they shop and how they buy. Consumers are seeking flavor. I'm going to talk a little bit about that RTD spirit thing, which is kind of crazy. A lot of flavor stuff and variety going on there. They're asking for transparency, seeking more information about exactly what they're eating and drinking, and they're often looking for that on the package itself or in some other easy manner, and that's going to sort of play a role, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Increasingly tied to their devices. Certainly the consumer is very diverse and growing more diverse all the time in terms of race and ethnicity, but also just huge generational differences between, say, Gen Z in one hand, millennials, boomers, seniors, just all sorts of differences in terms of how they approach things. So, Dale, why don't you tell us a little bit about, I'm going to hand this to you because you're going to roll a little bit about describing the wine consumer.
Thank you, Danny. And how many of you have seen this chart? This is Wine Market Council. You should go out to winemarketcouncil.com. Wine Market Council has been doing a segmentation study. You want to go over there? A segmentation study on the wine consumer since the late 1990s, and we have been repeating this. So we have great history on what the wine consumer looks like. And the important thing here, and when our segmentation is done on frequency. The first thing to point out here is that 18% of the adult population in this country are considered core wine drinkers. These are people who drink wine once a week or more often. So we're fighting over 45 million people in the wine industry. Those are the people that really drive the industry. This is what makes the volume happen. There's another 15% of the population, and that 15% are occasional wine drinkers. They drink wine not every week, but a couple times a month. It's in their repertoire. They're using it. Then you have this group out there, 29% of the population that we call non-adopters. These are consumers who participate in the beer category and or the spirits category, but don't really participate in the wine category. And if you look at the growth years in the wine category, a lot of that growth came from these consumers, where we moved people from being beer consumers and spirits consumers into the wine category. And that's where we really grew. We're now really seeing that area grow. And then also there's up there this abstainer category. And we have to remember that 28% of the adult population does not participate in the beverage alcohol category at all, and we're keeping an eye on that group. Then when we look at who's drinking more and who's drinking less, and this is just a simple question, do you plan on drinking more or drinking less? And the net of it is we're putting more pressure on fewer people, because what we see here is that top group, which is high frequency, high end. So those are consumers who drink wine once a week or more often and purchase wine products over $20 on a regular basis. Those are the consumers who say they're going to drink more. Those are the consumers who are already drinking a lot. Where we're not really seeing consumption grow is in that all other area down there. Those people are pulling back on wine, so we're seeing a reduction in wine consumers. Now, if we come in and we look at those groups by age category, and it's really important to think about how that transitions through the years. And you can see here that the highest percentage of core wine drinkers is out there in that oldest group. So we have people aging out of the category, and we're not really replacing them as we come through. We really, and I do think we know that as people age, as a young group, they come into the wine category. So those first two buckets, I'm not really worried about them. I'm not worried. Matter of fact, I'm encouraged by the 20% that's in that 30 to 39. That's a great thing to see, because we'll probably get more people in that one. However, we have a little bit of a hole there, because those other two, that group that is in there that is from 40 to 60, they're not going to change their habits a whole lot. And we've not brought those people into the category. The other area that we have is about ethnicity. What's happening with Black consumers and what's happening with Hispanic consumers. And we are not reaching this audience. We have never reached this audience well. And you can see what that looks like and how that plays out. So that's something that we as a category have to really think about and start to move towards. And then this shows us what has happened through the years. So you can see versus 2017, we have lost a number of core wine consumers. We've lost marginal wine consumers. There's been a growth in that all other category, the beer and spirits consumer. That's a good target again for us to go after. We do, and we'll talk more about health and wellness later, but that is something that we also want to keep an eye on. Expanding on the group of ethnicity and thinking about that. High frequency, this is the high frequency, high end consumer, and that's most of your targets, right? That's who we want to go after, most of the people in this room. And you can see that 75% of that population is done by current Caucasian white consumers. We're really lacking there on the Hispanic consumer, somewhat on the Black consumer. That's why we have to go after that target, and that's a growing target. Then when we look at price and we think about where price is and where people purchase products at what price levels, you can see that over $50 category, we have an opportunity with ethnic consumers that we need to address. We also have to remember then as we go through this, and when Danny starts really going through category numbers, we're going to see that we're losing most of our business at the low end. A lot of people come into the category at the low end, especially when you see that with that Hispanic consumer. How do we make that category more attractive and make sure that we're bringing in new consumers? Price does play a role in the choices that consumers make. And with that, Danny, why don't you expand a little bit on customer choice?
So choice. There is an abundance of choice. And the abundance of choice just keeps getting more abundant, which sort of fragments how the consumer and what the consumer is doing in terms of their choices. The choices are around, there's no shortage of choices just within mainstream beer, wines, and spirits. Then you've also got non-alcoholic adult beverages, and you look at like the beer category in particular. Every major and now minor beer player has a non-alcoholic version that actually tastes pretty good compared to the alcoholic version. Not quite as developed within wine, but it's coming too, and there's some of that within spirits as well. Then there's traditional beverages, just mainstream beverages. Social moderation plays a part in some consumers choosing that instead of an alcoholic drink. Then you've got things like cannabis, which is also playing a part in consumer choice, particularly at the younger end, where again, we may be losing occasions to people that are choosing cannabis in all its different forms, as opposed to a glass of wine or beer or spirits. They also have tons of choice in terms of where to buy. Could be in a store, could be in a restaurant, in a bar, could be in a tasting room. They could walk into a place and buy something. They can sit at home and order something and have it delivered to me or to your house. So there's no shortage of choice. And part of that choice is showing up in something as diverse as this. I think the numbers in the middle are a bit hard to read. We can't read it, but you just look at that shelf, and if you've walked into a store lately, that's where all of this category that it's really hard to define. Some are calling it RTDs, some are calling it kind of the fourth category, some are calling it alternative alcoholic beverages, some are calling it beyond the core, all sorts of different terms, and frankly, everyone's defining it a bit differently. But if you add up all that stuff that crosses beer, wine, and spirits, let's call it RTDs for now, that's $10 billion of stuff. That category was less than $5 billion back in 2019. So there's been $5 billion of consumer growth in that sort of fourth category that's coming from something else because consumers are not drinking more in total. If I put that $10 billion just in context for you, $10 billion, and these are Nielsen tracked channels, that's about the size of Nielsen's measurement of the California table wine industry in the Nielsen channels. So a huge amount of business is done there. If I then want to try to separate it out, and I don't think consumers are separating it out like industry people like to do, but if we try to separate it out into malt-based stuff, wine-based stuff in the middle. I'm sorry, the numbers, beer is on the left, wine is in the middle, wine-based types of products. Spirits are on the right-hand side. And to give you some context around numbers, that left-hand side is about $8 billion. The middle is about $1 billion. And the right-hand side, where the RTD spirits world lives, that's about $1.3 billion. And it's growing at 68% a year and hasn't slowed down at all. RTD spirits, that sort of premixed cocktail, largely in a can, that's now the second biggest spirits category in volume, sort of tied with tequila and American whiskey behind vodka. So that's how big it has become. And there are lots and lots of players in it. It's inhabited not by just spirit companies. You've got, for instance, wine companies like Gallo with High Noon. You've got Anheuser-Busch playing in it. You've got Constellation playing in it. You've got Molson Coors playing in it. So everyone is trying to have an RTD entry in a category that's growing that quickly. And there are also like many state-by-state battles in terms of fighting for lower taxes by the spirits industry, fighting for greater access to more stores. So as if they win those battles, that will continue to grow that segment of the business. On the wine side of things, we've done some things. There's wine in cans that arguably haven't, if we look at the numbers, not all that big, hasn't done all that well compared to some of the other canned entries in, say, spirits and obviously beer. But we've got like a flavored beverage wine category with some interesting innovation over the last 2 or 3 years, and wine cocktails. If you add all that up, it's about $500 million of business that's grown from $200 million back in 2019. So we've done a little bit of that, but again, we've got some real tough competition against our friends in the beer and wine industry. I mentioned cannabis early on as another choice. Dale, I think you got some perspective, Wine Market Council, on that.
You can just go ahead. So first thing I would tell you is that it's really hard to do research on the cannabis category right now. But we at Wine Market Council, we are kicking off research where the basic question we're trying to answer is what's wrong with the wine category, and what things are impacting the wine category, and we're going to try and include cannabis in there as a choice. This is one thing that I did notice, and this is from a company called Civic Science, who does online polling. Back in January, and this is, by the way, the ultimate correlation does not equal causation, one data point, but they asked people what they were substituting for beverage alcohol during their dry January when they were staying dry. And you can see here how the impact of cannabis on the younger consumer. It's just straight down, right? As you start going on that from an age standpoint, that cannabis usage. And for me, have always said that there were not a whole bunch of people, certainly my age, waiting around at home for cannabis to be legal to participate in the category. If you wanted to participate, you could participate, right? You could go find it at all will. However, with this younger consumer, it's a different story. They're going to be coming through this normalized with cannabis being legal and just being another choice. So that is where we see the vulnerability is really on that younger consumer, more likely to be playing in the cannabis space than the older consumer will. So with that, we'll get back to you with answers when we get them at the Wine Market Council, and we're going to have Danny actually dig into some category trends.
So we're going to look at first, the sort of the three-tier side of things. We're going to use a data source called SipSource, which is a relatively newer data source. It combines data, depletion data from 17 wholesalers now across the country, including the 3 biggest, Southern Glazers, RNDC, Breakthrough, and then 14 others, to sort of round out a national view. The good thing about that is that it covers on and off premise, and you know all about the channel shifting over the last 3 or 4 years due to COVID. So it combines all that data together and separates it so that we can look at sort of a bigger picture view. And then we can drill down to things like varietals, price tiers, regions, sub-regions, appellations, where the product is depleted into, et cetera, et cetera. So the first view I'm going to provide is total spirits, which is in green, and then wine on the bottom in red, and then beer is in the middle. Beer comes from the Beer Institute numbers. These are 12-month rolling volume percent changes, okay, going back to October of 2021, and then right up through March of 2023. You can see spirits has been at the top for quite a long time, continues to be at the top, although its growth rate has come down a lot. But especially now when we're looking at numbers, we have to think about what are we comparing against. Spirits was growing at 8 or 9% on volume. That's not sustainable, so it was not a surprise. Like we could have predicted, we did predict that the growth rate will decrease, and it has. And then if you take RTD spirits out of that, the growth rate differential between spirits in total versus spirits less RTDs, there's about a 2 to 3 point differential. That's how much the RTD sector is added to the growth of the spirits category. Beer has sort of been muddling around smaller single-digit losses for quite some time. And then wine has been trailing. It continues to trail. But the real story for wine is really about price tiers and the bifurcation of the business at the low end versus the high end. So now I'm going to show you what that looks like just for wine. The high end, again, these are 12-month rolling numbers, is the top. The middle is the blue, and then the lower end, under $11, is the red. We defined high, and we've got different ways of breaking it out. In this case, it's $15 and above for table wine, $18 and above for sparkling wine. So a couple things, and again, I'll go back to the story of we really have to be conscious of what we're comparing against. That high end, we were comparing against huge growth rates. Think about what was happening in late 2021, early first part of 2022. You know, we weren't traveling, we weren't going out to restaurants as much as we would have liked to. We weren't going to concerts. You know, COVID was rampant, and we weren't doing a lot of things, and we were getting money from government in some cases, whether it's personal or business. So we had a lot more money to spend, and a lot of us spent it on wine and high-end wine, which led to some huge growth rates. But now we've got the comparisons against that huge growth, and you know, that's tough to do, to grow something on top of the plus whatever it is, plus 10, 15%. So the lines are converging for now, but I also think that once we get to, I'm going to say sort of late Q3 of this year, maybe Q4, the lines will start separating again, and we'll see that green, or at least I'm predicting and hoping that that green will turn around again. Won't get back to where we were, you know, back a year ago, but it'll start heading north again. If we put that sort of in a different light, these are kind of the same numbers, just shown a bit differently, going from the left-hand side, which is the lower end. Under $11 is 73% of the volume of the wine business. It's tough for the wine industry to grow when 70% of the wine industry is in decline, as it has been for 2 years in a row now. Getting a little bit better, but still a decline on top of a decline is not a good thing. 11 to 15, I would have hoped that would benefit from, say, some of the inflationary pressures, and consumers might have traded down from higher end into that 11 to 15. We haven't seen that, unfortunately. Then when we get to the 15 plus, that's where we see, again, those huge growth rates in 2021, and then 2022, it's come way down. But even if I'm looking at say that $50 plus, a flat on top of a plus 35, that's really good, because I look at things on a sort of 2 or 3 year basis. So we're up a lot versus a couple of years ago. So that's kind of just a price tier picture. We're going to go a little bit more into varietals and so on in a couple minutes, but first let's talk about route to market.
And so with route to market, we certainly do recommend a multi-channel strategy, right? And thinking about things from a multi-channel, if you're leveraged against one channel, you're going to feel some pain as things do switch around channels. But I had to dust off a very old slide and bring it out. And this is the route to market challenges. And if you go back to 1999 and look at this, and these are estimates. I think the first time I saw this, it was done by John Fredrickson, and I think I just took these numbers off of his work back then. But you know, there were 2,674 domestic wineries. So, and this is just looking at it from a domestic standpoint. And there were about 3,000 distributors. So it was really easy to get your product to market. Fast forward, now let's jump up to the end of 2022, and all at once, now what we see here is that we've got 838 distributors, and that I went through and tried to pull out multiples, and we now have 11,546 wineries. This is all coming from the Wines and Vines database. So when we look at that, historically, what we've always done is we've always focused on that bottom number, that 838, and that is a challenge. However, we never talk about that top number. And is 11,546 wineries the right number? Well, if you go back to 1990 or the mid-1990s and come up to about 2015, consumption in this country for wine doubled. Right? So basically from 1995 to 2016 in that area, somewhere in that place, we now drink twice as much wine as we did back then. It was easy to add those wineries, and you could grow that business. You know, you could wake up and you were pretty much guaranteed about 3.5% growth rate volumetrically. Not the case anymore. So as we look at this, how do we adjust to that? And how do we think about that the route to market? Because these challenges aren't going to go away. They are what they are. Danny mentioned on-premise. We know that we saw that big move in the on-premise. And we can see here, and we know that the on-premise is really more impactful for higher priced wines, right? As you go up the scale of price, it more volume is done in the on-premise. And this again is SipSource data. We've seen how that on-premise data has now come down. It's normalizing, it's getting close. Well, when we saw the big dip on-premise, at the pandemic, we immediately saw this big shoot up at the retail side that balanced it out. We're not seeing that here now, right? Retail is remaining flat. Retail is not growing. If we're going to grow, we've got to get back to where the retail side of things is growing. We anticipate that we're going to end up with the on-premise probably moving to flat to -1 before, I'd say in the next 3 months or so. Maybe certainly by the next 6 months, we're not going to see growth in that area. With that, Danny, why don't you look a little more and dig deeper on channels?
Yeah, and so one thing I heard a few wineries saying, geez, my on-premise business isn't growing like it was, last year. Well, you're not alone. I mean, that's the reality of what we've seen with channel shifting over the last couple of years. I want to go deeper into channels and back to like the question being what channel, what's your portfolio and what channel are you focused on or should you be focused on in terms of the size of that channel? And I'm going to show you just a couple quick examples. This one happens to be for Cabernet Sauvignon in the on and off premise, and I've just broken out different price tiers into the percentage of business those price tiers do across different channels. All the blue numbers are different sub-channels within off-premise. The red is the percentage of volume business done in the on-premise, and again, then we broke out the on-premise into things like restaurants, bars, recreation, which are things like private clubs, golf clubs, theaters, concert halls, et cetera, et cetera. To Dale's point, as the price point moves up, you can see how dramatically the business shifts from primarily an off-premise business on the lower side to much more so of a balance between on and off-premise. Within that, you can see that grocery becomes much less important as you move up through price points, as we would expect, whereas liquor stores, for instance, become much more important. So you can see these shifts for different varietals. They don't all behave like this. That's where it's important to figure out, like, what's your portfolio? How does your portfolio behave? Here's an example for Chardonnay, sort of the same slide setup. It's even more pronounced that once you get up into the 25 plus for Chardonnay, you're talking about a balance between on and off premise in terms of the percentage of volume. You still get that grocery becomes less important as you move to the right. Liquor becomes more important as you move to the right. And you get maybe some surprises. Like I noticed that 12.7% number on the far right-hand side for $50 plus. That's 13% of the business for Chardonnay $50 plus is coming from the recreation channel. That's golf clubs, private clubs, again, theaters, concert halls, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a huge amount of business that's there, but it's an important channel if you have a product that fits that price tier criteria. The other view that I took, just to try to think about like what's my brand and where does my brand potentially have the best chance for success is, and there's going to be a bunch of numbers on here, so let me just explain it. First of all, these are all Nielsen scanning numbers from the off-premise side of things. The left-hand side are the top 12 national brands in the country, starting with Barefoot is number one, then Josh, quickly gaining, et cetera. If I add the top 12, that's about 25% of the wine business is in the off-premise is coming from those 12 brands. That's also amidst, by the way, on the Nielsen database, 18,000 brands. So 12 brands out of 18,000 do 25% of the business. But then what I looked at is how does the top 12 look across different aspects of the business? I looked at things like total U.S. food, total U.S. liquor. Then I looked at the leading, I disguised the names, but the leading e-commerce wine retailer, which maybe could be something like a wine.com, or a large health and wellness retailer that's the biggest natural and organic retailer nationally in the country that maybe starts with a whole. I looked at the natural channel. I looked at New York City liquor versus California liquor versus Florida liquor, different parts of the country. And then I looked at another channel through friends at NRS Insights that measures bodegas, that channel. And I ended up with 24 brands that were only on one list. So these are brands that are very focused on a certain channel because of either their price tier or their, the varietal or something, maybe it's the relationship with that channel or that retailer. There were only 7 brands that ended up on 4 or more lists. So things get pretty fragmented, and when we're in a flat market, we got to look a lot harder for the opportunities and the channel strategy that fits with my brand or brands and my organization and its priorities. I'm going to switch over to the on-premise just for a second. Dale talked about how the growth rates really come down over the last couple of years as people have, they went back to the on-premise. Now things are more normalized. What that 88 means is that the importance of the on-premise is 12 percentage points, but on an index relative to what its share was in 2019, it's 12% less important than what it was back in 2019. There are challenges in the on-premise, not just for wine, but for beer and spirits as well. There's structural challenges. There's several thousand, I think what's the number on here, 15 to 20,000 less on-premise locations. They've never reopened. They may not ever reopen. They're working on shorter hours. There's consumer and behavioral changes that have occurred. Personally, I'm far more comfortable now being at home and watching, Nets or streaming something, ordering something, have it delivered to my house. I may not go back to the same behaviors that I once did pre-COVID. There's competitive factors. I can spend $15 on a glass of wine in a restaurant, or I can have a bartender or a mixologist make me a really cool cocktail that I'm not going to make at home myself for that same $15. And those are the choices that consumers are making. So we have not recovered in the on-premise to the extent that, say, spirits has. And frankly, I think that's still going to be a challenge sort of going forward, and we may have to adjust our thinking about the on-premise versus off-premise opportunities for us. I'm just going to show one slide on DTC because we've got some great panels. I know George lined up for the morning and afternoon from Enolytics and from Community Benchmark and so on, and they're far more expert in that area. Just one slide. These are DTC shipments only from Sovos Ship Compliant and Wines Vines Analytics. It shows dollars and volume from 2017 up through 2022, and then I added on the Q1 2023 numbers in that little table. So shipments certainly benefited from COVID and that people weren't going to tasting rooms and the business took off. Then it started to level off as we went into 2022. So there's been some ups and downs, but if I kind of draw a straight line from 2017 to where we are now, it's kind of, you take out all the shifts going on in between, and we're kind of where the trajectory was, before COVID. My only concern, or my additional concern, is that the Q1 2023 numbers have not been good at all. Again, I'm sure John and Kathy will talk more about that. Weather didn't help, bad weather in March, so hopefully that'll bounce back a bit. But that's a channel that had been fueling growth. We can't count on that for the kind of growth that we had seen in the past few years. So I'm going to turn it back to Dale, and he's going to take us through a little bit more on sort of product segment opportunities.
Thank you, Danny. And other than wanting to put a bunch of pretty colors up on a screen, Let me explain to you what you're looking at here. So this is for table wine, and I've broken this out. This is sip source data, so it includes on, off premise, all channel, depletion, it's volumetrically. Bubble size represents, or the size represents how big it is, what its share is of what you see on there. I've broken this down by white wine, red wine, and pink wine, and those are various price segments of those categories. Had I known we were going to be doing polling, I would have made everybody guess what one of these is, right? And then the vertical axis represents growth rate. How fast is it growing or not growing? And the horizontal axis is about what percentage of that category is done in the on-premise. And when you start thinking about your portfolio and managing your portfolio, these are things that I would look at. If I'm going to enter a category, how big is the category? How am I going to get it to market? Am I going to have an on-premise strategy? Am I going to try and stay retail? What am I going to do with it? So I think that this is a really good way to look at it. You could easily do this and break this down and look at it by varietal. You could break it down. You could change the horizontal axis to mean other things. But here's what they are, right? And there's really no surprises. We talked about as price goes up, the presence of on-premise or the importance of on-premise increases dramatically. So you can see out there that red, white, and these are over $11 price segments. You can see the price tiers that are really strong out there on the right-hand side. You can also see how small they are, right? White wine over $50. That's that little bitty dot there. Compare that to the red over $50, dramatically different. And you'll notice there's nothing there for pink wines, right? Because you just don't have that within the rosé category. By the way, if you look at the pink dots, you better have a retail strategy. If you really want to make a difference with a rosé, you better go to retail, because there's some being done in the on-premise. It's a decent amount, but nothing compared to where white and red is. Same exact thing, only now we're looking at sparkling wine and taking a look at what sparkling wine is. And now within SipSource, we're able to break out Prosecco, Cava, and we look at all other, look at champagne, so we can break those out and look at them by price points. And there's a couple of interesting things that I see here that were really surprising to me. The first one is on Prosecco. And when I look at Prosecco are the two big things that are growing on the left and the right. So my Prosecco category that is $8 to $13, that's all retail. However, when I come over here to the Prosecco 17 or 13 to 18, look how important on-premise is to that Prosecco category. Then when I look at champagne, it flips, because champagne over $75 is that little, by the way, I'm colorblind, so it's that little light colored dot. Don't know what color it is. Yellow?
Yeah.
Yellow. We'll go with yellow. That is champagne. So when we look at that, look how important retail is to that. However, when I go to that $35 to $75 price range, look how important on-premise is to that category. So you can do this, and when you start thinking about your portfolio management, this is a tool that you can use to start to make your portfolio come together and think about, where am I going to go, where should I enter, and where would I be successful and go to that. Next slide. This is as much about, frankly, a commercial for SipSource. Danny and I both work for the SipSource people. We've now added appellation to the SipSource data. So I can now start to look at Sonoma versus Napa versus Santa Barbara. This is for table wine over $25, and we can see here, Santa Barbara's doing really well. Sonoma is doing better than Napa right now within this price range, and it's getting growth. This is an area that we can look at within SipSource, that we can really start to look at and think about it more closely on what's going on and what's doing well. Could break this down by varietal and many, many other things. Now I'm going to turn it over to Danny to talk about that price range and varietal matrix.
Yeah, I'm just going to show one slide really, because I was trying to summarize. If you go across price tiers, starting from the low end, and then go up and down in terms of varietals, and I colored the boxes where we've seen consistent year-on-year growth, so 2 years of growth. And I've colored it in terms of the size of that segment. So if I'm looking at a yellow box, that means it's grown really nicely over the last 2 years consecutively, and that price tier represents over 10% of that varietal's volume. Going down to the blue, it's sort of 1 to 5% of that varietal's volume. The green is between 5 and 10%. So these are all sort of chunky pieces of volume. The first thing you notice, you don't see anything highlighted in the 8 to 11. There's no growth year on year, at least, in that price range. Then you start to move off to the right, and that's where we start to see some pieces of good news, areas of growth within the kind of varietal price tier segment of the business. We're going to spend the last sort of 5 minutes, 10 minutes max, talking about a subject that I think, we hear about. We're going to continue to hear about it because it's not just the wine industry; it's the entire world, and certainly the consumer packaged goods industry. And that's more and more attention and interest with respect to ESG factors, environmental, social governance. And that's spurred really by a whole lot of circumstances. We've had the pandemic. There's concerns about climate change. There's been a ton of global supply chain issues. There's economic gaps. There's social justice movements, and they're all catalysts for spiking adoption rates in businesses. And importantly, it's also accelerated by just an increasing body of research that shows a positive link between ESG performance and business outcomes, positive financial outcomes. And then I'll add on just a little piece that we'll talk about as well, about sort of the growing consumer desire in living healthier lives, and how what they put in their mouth, whether it be to eat or to drink, aligns with that. So there's kind of the two aspects of wellness. One is the wellness for me, and that's the health and wellness and kind of what lifestyle do I want to live. And then the right-hand side is more of the we side of things, which is, how are my choices sustaining the world? The left-hand side would include things like organic and things like on labels free from sugar, free from sulfites, free from gluten-free, et cetera, et cetera. On the right-hand side, it's certainly driven by government mandates. Maybe it will increasingly, certainly driven by costs due to climate change, and just escalating consumer demand and interest. Nielsen did a study, and they also asked consumers, who should be responsible for those things? And really, consumers are saying that the brand owners, many of you, should be taking the lead on those things. They also say that secondly, they themselves need to take a lead and be mindful of the choices they make. And thirdly, retailers, and that's amongst 7 or 8 different choices. Those are the top 3. So consumers are certainly expecting companies and brands to take an active environment and social stance, and then also communicate it. And that communication could be on your websites, or it could be on the package itself. So consumers expect it, and secondly, I'm not going to go through all these numbers here, but many value it, and many will pay extra for it as well. I'm going to turn it over to Dale in a second, but just as a forerunner for what Dale's going to talk about, the TTB is expected to announce regulatory proposals, and is now taking input around 3 distinct areas around alcohol labeling requirements. And those 3 areas are ingredient labeling, nutritional information, and serving facts, potentially panels. And the third thing is allergen disclosure. So that is a very active discussion point going on right now. And then the Wine Market Council has done a bit of research about how consumers think about that and what are their perceptions. So I'm going to have Dale cover that part.
Thank you, Danny. And again, Wine Market Council, we knew that this was coming, right? This is already happening in the EU, where you're going to have to do that. We wanted to look at it through the consumer lens, and does the consumer think that this is important? Do they not? So we did a specific study on that. Again, go to winemarketcouncil.com. It is an extremely affordable area for you to join and get the full deck on this. I'm going to cover 3 slides. So the first thing that we did is we just simply asked the question, compared to these items, how important is it that and the top is nutrition, top is ingredient, bottom is nutrition. How important is it that these are on the labels, that these things actually do exist? And we also put other food groups in there to get a benchmark. And really the net of this is that it's not really a burning demand for the consumer that wine comes up with these. The consumer, you've got the should be, you've got 36%, 38%. So it's not like there's this huge consumer drive to get it on there. However, it's going to happen. The other thing that we really are looking at is, can you do it on the label, or can you do it via a QR code, right? A way that to link from the bottle to that, probably a pretty elegant solution. However, the other thing that we asked about is on an ingredient label. How do you feel about these ingredients? And we put these ingredients up there. Are you neutral on it? Do you feel positive about it? Do you feel negatively about it? How it is that 1% of the population thinks that grapes are negative in wine, I don't know. But this is what happens when you do research. But there's one glaring ingredient out there, sulfites. Right? We still have this thing about sulfites where the consumer, 50% of the consumer just saw that as negative. We purposely did put something like malolactic bacteria culture in there to compare that. You know, they're not that bothered by that one, right? That's okay, but somehow sulfites are really, really bad for you. And that's just one of those things that we as an industry have to live with. Then the next thing, and this is, to me, this is probably more on the positive side. So when you look at nutritional information, that sugar, and when we think about this with sugar, and you look at that, the consumer really thinks there's a lot of sugar in wine. A lot of consumers think that the sugar content of wine is high. Not necessarily on carbohydrates, not necessarily on calories, but man, they do think that there's a ton of sugar in there. Most wine consumed is finished dry, as we all know. So this actually could be something that ends up being a positive. As we look at this, Danny, I think you're going to talk about what attributes really do make a difference within that space from a consumer standpoint.
So there definitely are, increasing amounts of producers that are paying attention to this, and through their innovations and so on, are introducing products to the marketplace. And Nielsen does a pretty good job, I think, of studying different attributes and what kind of growth comes from those things. The chart that I'm going to show you is first across total alcohol, not just wine, and then I'll show you wine-specific wine. But these are some these are things that are claims on package across alcohol products that are resonating in terms of growth. No sugar, I think that's the plus 25%. Environmentally friendly, certified things on package is a pretty good growth rate. You have gluten-free, things like calories, things like recyclable. All of those, and we know the wine market is flat to declining, so when I see pluses, I kind of get excited because I'm always looking for where are the growth opportunities. Specific to wine itself, I looked at different, so this is wine only, and I looked at dollars back to 2018 and up through the latest 52 weeks, which I think is through the end of the year. And these things, so these are wine products with these attributes on the package, are growing. I would still say they're niche. They're not like, these are not 5 or 10% of the marketplace. These are sometimes a 0.5 percentage point, 1 percentage point, 1.5 percentage point. But generally they're moving up in terms of growth. So as long as these products, the consumer feels they taste good, there's legs here in terms of where we can find some bits of growth. So I'm going to end it off just with this one slide. I mean, we kind of talked about the consumer. We talked about the economic conditions that we're all living with. We talked about the compressed market growth and how do we grow in a flat market. And we talked about route to market. And so, I hope that, you're all thinking about, how do you grow in a flat market with respect to your consumer strategy, your portfolio strategy, your route to market strategy, and your ESG strategy to hopefully win in the marketplace. Anything you want to say, Dale? Yeah,
and for me, I think when we opened this about talking about headwinds and talking about challenges, and we do have challenges. However, the good news is we've learned a lot about what our challenges are, and we can take steps to address it. And it really is up to all of us in the room to take that challenge. The wine category is It's not go. Look. It's a $70 billion industry. It's still going to be here, and I don't want people to get too doomsday on it. But challenging to grow is going to be hard. But I think that we can lay out a roadmap on how we get there, and that's really about opening up, appealing to a new consumer base, thinking about some products differently and what people are drinking, what their palates are, and how do we reach them and get them into the wine category over the long term. So while it's challenging, I think we're going to be able to identify why we're not growing like we should, and then the question is, are we able to take the steps to do that? And that's what we have to do. So. With that, George, we can take questions.
Yeah, we've got time for a couple of questions. The first thing I probably should have said when I was on stage is that you will have access to all of the slides. So we'll contact everyone afterwards and provide a link so you'll be able to get these copies of these slides. Yeah, so we have time for a couple quick questions. You referenced the natural channel. Can you talk about, to better kind of define what that means?
I mean, that's another one that's like RTDs. What do you define as natural channel? But if I gave you some specific examples, it's places like Whole Foods, Sprouts,
Gus's.
Yeah, it's that kind of channel that would have been defined within that. When I showed you those brands, that's what the natural channel is.
And then one final question: is this a cycle that we've ever seen before, or is this just sort of?
I think not. I mean, we have seen, like Dale said, we have been fortunate, for years and years and years to see consistent growth. And even when, there was recessions and so on, people switched around in price points, but the wine market still grew. We have not, since 2017, 18, things started to slow down and in decline. I'm much younger than Dale, of course, but I've not seen that cycle before.
I've been in the industry longer, and I think back kind of to this is horrible to say, like the mid '80s. And back in the mid '80s, we were facing some challenges. There were things that happened, and all at once you had this thing called White Zinfandel that just brought a whole bunch of people into the category, right? And then we had this thing called wine coolers, right? And that brought a whole bunch of people into the category. But if you think about dry table wine, like table wine and those, we've been through some cycles. And I do think the other part of that question is, when will it end? But we have a hole here in consumers, right? We pointed that out, that we've got this era of people that are kind of in that 40 to 60 year age group that just aren't core wine drinkers. I think that we see young people are drinking wine. However, it's kind of back to where it was in the mid 90s, where wine is seen as for special occasions. And so on young people, Danny talked about the proliferation of products. They're drinking beer, they're drinking spirits, they're drinking RTDs, they're drinking all of this on an everyday basis. When they want to elevate, they go to wine. And they buy high-end wine, by the way, right? Their entry point is a little bit higher. However, they're just not choosing it as frequently. How do we win occasions? How do we get wine in there to compete for those occasions that currently they're choosing an RTD, a beer, or a spirit?
Well, thank you guys so much. Big hand for Danny and Dale.